Can we reimagine the systems we live in? How can economics reflect our common humanity? And can we change it in time?
Welcome back to Real Time with Steve and friends. We are back better than ever. We've got a special guest today with us, Kathleen Tyson. She's going to be talking about the new international monetary order. It's going to be a whole lot of fun, so be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
Were you expecting someone else? If you were expecting Ty or Dan, you're not on the wrong live stream. Ty and Dan have not left the building. You'll be pleased to know this is not some glitch in the matrix. But for now, you've got me, Dave Folks, hosting some weeks, and you've got Ty some weeks. Welcome back to the good old, but completely new, unplugged and then replugged, Real Time with Steve Keen and friends. Why do I suddenly feel like I'm channeling pigs in space? Showing my age already. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I'm not an economist. I know what you're thinking. I got the glasses, I got the elbow patches, and you're thinking, this guy's living the dream, hosting a show about economics without actually being an economist, almost like living the life of a supermodel without being good looking. I'm basically your warm-up monkey. We'll be joined by Mike and Steve shortly, and of course, our guest, Kathleen Tyson, to hear her explain what a world moving away from US dollar domination will mean. It's not the end of the world, people. Things will be fine. Probably. We'll find out, but she'll be talking about her new book. If you're just joining us, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button. It's free to do that, costs you nothing. Hit that bell, then you'll know every time we go live. And share the link to the show right now, because the more there are of us here together live, the better it is. Yes, you. I'm talking to you. While we wait for a few more people to join us, let's have a quick economics news roundup. All the big stories of the last week that only economic nerds are interested in. Know thyself. Japan refuses to implode on Q despite the declining value of the yen against the dollar, which is incredibly inconvenient for economists who have assumed high public debt and low inflation is against some undiscovered law of physics. So Japan, if you're listening, could you get on with becoming the new Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe caricature? That would be helpful.
Economists have built an entire model of how things should work, and you're just ruining it.
This might not be a real news report. I'm not a journalist either. Did I mention that? The Jared Bernstein snippet from the Stephanie Kelton documentary Finding the Money, in which the chair of economic advisors to President Biden managed to eat an entire word salad in an attempt to avoid admitting that he has no idea why the US government says that it needs to borrow its own currency from itself, has been more widely shared by people defending Bernstein for being unfairly gotcha'd. I mean, why do economic advisors to the president need to have solid answers to silly abstract hypotheticals like how the entire system of money works? It's just cruel to expect them to make sense, right?
Why can't everyone let economists just get back to making Federal Reserve press releases that sound like ChatGPT has written a horoscope using random words from an economics crossword puzzle?
You know? And drawing curves on napkins. Remember that? Like the good old days. Leave them alone, poor sods. Now, having been a guest, I already know how much fun it is having you guys here with us. So thank you and welcome. I'm sure you've already subscribed, liked, and hit that notification bell. You can find Steve on Twitter at Prof. Steve Keen, on LinkedIn as Dr. Steve Keen, and on YouTube as Prof. Steve Keen. Now, hell, just any platform you're on, just put in Prof. Steve Keen and you'll find him. So now you know I'm not going anywhere. We should get to know each other a bit, because that's how live streams work. What I mean is, we're not just going to throw Steve, Mike, and today's guest, Kathleen, straight in like a hand grenade. It's a gentle build-up. Get the experts in too early, talking about finance, numbers, and politics, and everyone goes crazy. So you got to be careful. That's why we're here, getting to know each other. To be honest, I won't do this every time I'm hosting, but I think the first time, you got to know, who is this guy? And I think that's fair. So I'm Dave. I'm a Taurus. I like movies, cooking, cold water swimming. Not all at the same time, obviously. You might wonder why I agreed to take on the hosting of the show, since I'm not an economist or any kind of financial academic, because I was asked. Well, that's true. And I'm really grateful to Ty and the team back there for asking me. Why did I say yes? Very quick background on me, and then let's talk to Mike, Steve, and our guest. In truth, I kind of have two lives. One of those lives as a producer, making videos and also doing training and helping businesses communicate better to build trust and convert more, basically, at the company I founded, Business Film Booth. And the other life, which isn't a blatant plug for my business, is one of pure curiosity, where I write and I make videos as an economic futurist whenever I can manage. It's a weird obsession. If you Google Dave Folks and Beyond Survival, you'll find me. I try to write from the point of view of us little guys as individual human beings that often feel caught up in the machinery of economics. So I may not be everyone's cup of tea, because it's not deep academic theory. It's just that we're social animals, and even the best ideas still need to be simplified and shared socially to become the new normal. And that's why communities like this are so important and should be supported. Galbraith may have been just hopeful when he said economics is far too important to be left to economists, but I think he was just being prescient about the communication tools we have today. And it's because of this show's mission to make sure the conversation is not just left to economists, that this important knowledge about how the world is put together is shared and humanized. That kind of got me hooked. So I reckon also it's the same reason that you're watching right now. So I'm a huge fan of the show. And even though most of what Mike says goes over my head, I love the show. So that's enough from me. Let's talk to some of the big brains. Speaking of Mike, can we get on Mike and have a chat? Here he is. Now, I can't hear you, Mike, personally, but that's okay, I think. Hang on a sec. What am I doing wrong?
No, that was me.
There we go. Oh, it was you. There we go.
Hey, Dave.
Because I was thinking, well, I don't know how to fix that.
No, I had my grandkids came home upstairs and were banging around, so I muted the mic.
And then you remembered. At least you remembered. Very good. How's your week been, mate?
Oh, we had a good week. I put doctoral hoods on two of my PhD students. We had commencement, so that was neat. And I mentioned I'm working for a nonprofit on the side, rehabbing a trailer for them. So that's what I'm doing this morning. So I have a wood shop and I enjoy carpentry, so that's kind of fun.
Very good.
So it's all good. Weather's cooperating.
The last time I was on the show, I think I accused you of being Tim the Toolman Taylor because you had the full-on carpenter's kit on. So that's
yes,
no lie. You
I
are
have
literally
several
talking.
pairs of those. Yeah, yeah. When it gets really dirty and nasty, that I put that on. Yeah.
Now I can see on the bigger screen. I think that everybody else can see on it, and to me, it looks like you're like in the set of Home Alone. But then I always think this when I'm anyone's home in America is like huge. I'm in a converted garage or garage in my place at home, and it always feels very small whenever I see someone else's home. But yeah, mate. So I've had
bigger houses mean more chores.
oh my God, they do actually. Yeah. So I'm not. Yeah, I am definitely grateful for my small English home. It's like I had a big home in Australia. I spent most of the time jet washing walls. It was just ridiculous. So we had a week where I got something turn up that I didn't think would be such a big hit at home. We replaced an old shed out the back and replaced it with a pub shed, right? So it had rakes and stuff, and I moved it all out and put in this pub shed. It's just basically a shed, but it's got a hatch. You can serve beer through it. Suddenly, I got a lot of friends, like neighbors just went, it's like, it's just a shed, but with a hatch and you can serve beer through. So that's been my week. It's discovering, well, one, how to build something like that, because I'm not like you, I'm not quite so handy, but I figured out how to build it. And then two, discovering calling a shed a pub in your back garden changes the dynamic completely.
Yeah, that actually shed building got really popular in the US during COVID when people were at home and people started building sheds for little offices or man caves or whatever. So the shed business went through the roof during COVID.
Yeah, that's it. Well, they've cornered a particular niche over here. Seriously, you Google pub shed in England and you get this like whole world has opened up.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah. And all the neighbors and buddies and such come over. Yeah.
Yeah. It's all it takes. Yeah. Did someone say pub? It's like that. Very good. All right. Well, look, should we get Steve on? What do you think?
His show, so sure.
I think we should bring him on.
Yeah.
Where is he? There he is. Hey, Steve.
Hi, guys.
Hey, Stevie.
Yeah, mate. My problem today is how do we live up to those bloody credits at the start? It looks like we should be having, a Marvel comic style interactions. Where are the lasers? You know, I feel a bit primitive.
We could have laser eyes, maybe. I mean, if we were hosting this on Instagram.
Let's not go there. I mean, please.
Too far.
No, Batcoin's a bit too much for me. But anyway, good to see you all.
Batcoin. Good to see you too.
Mm.
How's your week been? How's the book going?
Well, the book is finished. That's right. I'm actually about to sign a contract for a new one with a working title of How Economists Will Destroy Capitalism. So that's. I hope that'll.
Well, I think you're living up to the opening credits.
Thank you. So that'll be starting hopefully in about 2 or 3 months' time. In the meantime, I'm just back from where the hell did I go? I was in Australia for 3 weeks. That's why we shut the show down for a while. And I was working with Russell Standish, my great friend and brilliant programmer who wrote Minsky and also wrote Ravel. And we are now literally weeks from finally, after over a decade of developing the damn thing in our part-time, we're literally a couple of weeks from releasing Ravel commercially. So what I've been doing for the last few days is writing a tutorial, and then I've got to also dive in and rewrite the help system, because at the moment the help system is focused around Minsky, which of course is great for those doing system dynamics, but we're a minor and endangered species, as Mike knows all too well. People want to make money out of numbers, much larger species, much less endangered, unfortunately.
As in numbers go up, numbers.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm actually showing how to use Ravel for that rather than using a spreadsheet or a BI program or that sort of thing. We're going to release it in probably about 2 weeks on Patreon, $10 Australian a copy, which is about $6.50 American a month, and hoping I can enough sales to enable me to do the research in the manner to which I'd like to become accustomed.
Very, very good.
So, Steve, I'm reminded of a cartoon I saw years ago. The title of your new book, and it's the first panel is at that time the Soviet Union, and the leaders of the Soviet Union are on the top of the building, the Kremlin, and there's tanks going by. You know, they're reviewing, and then the next panel they're reviewing missiles going by, and in the last panel it's a bunch of men in suits walking by, and somebody says, "What's that?" He says, "Oh, that's our most destructive weapon. Those are our economists."
Yeah, I know. I've known that joke for a long time, and the old trouble about the joke is it's not funny.
I know, right? It's
bloody
it's
true.
funny, but it's good because it's true, right?
That's right. That's the edge to it is deadly. Yeah. So
Steve, this week I'm going to get you to do the top chatters if you don't mind.
I'll give it a try. Let's see how I manage. Okay.
Give it a try. Have a gulp of water. You can do this.
Okay. She watches web freaks. That sounds like she watches web freaks in a danger zone, learning lessons from economic in one lesson, while Josh Buckham looks on Tony Wilson's Douglas Jewell-Day Jovi and R. Thomas Roberts Political Economy 101 course about understanding MMT by Thomas Darlington, written by Miles Sedatar, starring Blue Jay, supporting act by Steve Frith. Janjo Geek confuses the dialogue. Preaching 565, Downtown Xmas 3 is up Michael D'Souza Cruz, who's saying, what a gusher to Blair Blair Blarg. And Jesus, says Rick O'Brien, wants to know what Skylar Jones is doing with Dregai, while Connor Howell is in Dean Walsh and Joan Washington and Bob Leroy, and Shane's got a Coughlin, leaving Michael Newman with the ghost in the half shell. Larry Summers being completely confused, as usual. David Collins, DJ, Matthew, Alex Plante, Mungo, Chibe Oade, Danny, Ken Crawford, D. Smith, Jim Roberts, Colonel Andy Bobbing, and Bill Zagogan.
Very good. One day we'll line them up so they all are just one long sentence and they all somehow make sense. The first few actually started to make a story.
Well, it's actually, if you an Aussie, I've actually got to check this background with you. Were actually,
I'm a Kiwi, but I have lived in Australia for 10 years.
Well, you would know the Australiana. You know the story Australiana by Ostentatious?
No, you got me.
You don't know that. Okay, well, I'll see if I can cue that up and I'll play it later. It's a monologue about life in Australia, starring Australia's peculiar creatures, such as, for example, Goanna, Mount Isa, and a few others. And the star of the whole show is the one who's seen a cockatoo. So.
Yeah, that sounds like an Aussie story, probably a kid's story as well.
Yeah, well, we teach it to our children. That's why they can stare so fucking well as they come out of the womb.
Very good. We should get on our guest who's been waiting patiently backstage for us. Kathleen Tyson, she is the founder and CEO at pacemaker.global, which offers tools for central banks and policymakers to help them move towards a multi-currency world. Here she is. Hello, Kathleen. Welcome to Steve Keen and Friends.
Thank you.
There we are.
Very nice to be invited.
We have a bandwidth problem, but we'll see if we can cope. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Kathleen, while we just see if that untangles itself, I'll just explain a little bit of background. Kathleen's the author of Multicurrency Mercantilism, and I hope, Kathleen, I'm not stealing your thunder when I say that when you started to do research for it, you did a Google search and discovered that there's literally zero searches for multi-currency mercantilism as a term. So maybe we should start there about what brings you to the idea of multi-currency mercantilism, and we'll work backwards.
Okay, thank you. It goes back to a quote from Henry Kissinger in 2014, in which I'm actually going to read it. Glasses on again. Kissinger said, when we talk about a global economy and then use sanctions within that global economy, then the temptation will be that big countries, thinking of their future, will try to protect themselves against the potential dangers. And as they do, they will create a mercantilist global economy. And of course, we've gone absolutely sanctions insane, especially, I mean, the sanctions started in the 1980s, but then we rolled out OFAC and FATCA, and then started coming up with economic sanctions on, in particular, China. And then with the war in Ukraine, rolled out 12,000 sanctions on Russia. And so the world is now defending itself against the threat of sanctions. And they're doing that by shifting to their own currencies. And as they shift to their own currencies, they are collaborating in a new way and creating a new monetary order independent of the G7 currencies, or at least parallel to the G7 currencies.
I think we are I want to really get into this later on with Mike and Steve. I think first up, if you don't mind, Kathleen, I was going to ask you to go back a little bit in time, and just because, when you think, I think of my earlier career, I certainly wasn't thinking I want to move trillions of dollars around the world in multiple currencies. Can I just take you back to where you felt like you realized that was your path, and let's work forward a little bit? Is that okay?
Oh, it's just dangerous to tell me that something's impossible.
I see.
So I started at the Federal Reserve.
Sounds familiar.
I started at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as a central banker in 1987, which was an interesting year because we had a rather enormous market crash in October. And I was put on a new group called the Settlement System Studies Group that studied how instability and liquidity risk spread from institution to institution in the financial sector. So from clearinghouses, from margin calls in Chicago, or driving program selling in New York as the market sold down and spiraled down. So that led to me being very interested in the plumbing. And I shifted from the path I'd started on to being more of a plumber. I was then brought to London as an expert in dematerialized securities to basically take paper out of the London Stock Exchange system and shift everything into digital security settlement, which happened in about 1994, I think. And then I got rather bored with a domestic market and decided to rebuild global markets, as one does. So I went to Clearstream. I invented something with Sahita Wan called tri-party repo, which is now $18 trillion a day in interbank credit, secured finance. And then I went and built CLS
Do you ever
Bank,
think to
which
yourself, I'm glad it
7
works? Is that every day it's moving that much money every day? And do you ever think, do you wake up any time and think, I really hope that works?
Just an average.
Yeah, okay. It's still huge amounts
Well,
of money.
When I wrote the first tri-party repo, the banks were saying, this is pointless. We don't need this. We'll never use it. So it was zero volume when we started.
Yeah.
But then once the banks saw the rationale for it,
once they started using it, that it would be huge, right? So you built it for that purpose.
I'm still surprised because it actually is growing. The growth in repo is accelerating. And so it's actually growing quite quickly at the moment, partly because there's less trust in the world. If you trust the people you're doing business with, and particularly the banks you're doing business with, then you'll extend to them a certain amount of unsecured credit. But the new capital rules from Basel III make that almost impossible. They almost insist on collateralization. And then also, as the world is globalizing and the globalization is intensifying, more banks are doing business with each other without having a long-term stable relationship. And so they will always want secured credit as well.
Steve or Mike, what are your thoughts on from your backgrounds, what Kathleen's talking about? What is the changes that she's seen or helped bring in? What do you see them as doing in the, and from your point of view, what's the big impact, the observation you've got?
You want to go first, Mike, or do I dive in here?
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. Look, very briefly, first of all, Kathleen's quite right that America has abused the exorbitant privilege it got out of being the reserve currency. And if you know our history, that was because Harry Dexter White basically steamrolled Keynes and steamrolled the Bretton Woods Agreement to use the American dollar for international exchange rather than Keynes' proposal of a manufactured currency called the bankor. And that had all sorts of distorting effects on the global economy. For a start, it meant that America had to run a trade deficit, ultimately because people had to have American dollars for trade with each other. So there's a demand for the dollars over and above the demand for American goods, and that has made it harder for American manufacturing to compete, which is, I think, part of what led to the Rust Belt. But it's also meant there's a huge circulation of dollars in international currency. And then, of course, when America started politicizing it, and that's just classic America, take what's supposed to be an informal mechanism for economic exchange and make it into a political weapon, that gave the countries America was trying to crush that way, Russia largely, but also Saudi Arabia, or rather the Arabian countries, not Saudi Arabia particularly, but Iran obviously, trying to crush these countries using the payment system. That just had to encourage people to look for alternative multi-currency ways. So I applaud what you're doing, Kathleen. I think it's extremely important given the abuse that America's made of the monetary system. Of course, it then raises all sorts of issues, and I would like to learn some of the technicalities. So the tripartite repo you're talking about there, it'd be nice to have that explained in detail, not just for the audience, but also for me, because as you say, you've become a plumber in the financial system, and I have far more respect for the plumbers of the financial system than I have for the bloody economists who put it together. So I'd like to get some of that plumbing explained to the audience as well.
Mike, what are your thoughts? What are you thinking?
Yeah.
So, yeah, my thoughts kind of parallel Steve's, post World War II, or I guess what Bretton Woods was 1944, so World War II wasn't quite over. But yeah, Keynes's idea for the bankor competed with the Bretton Woods system from the US. I suspect I wasn't there. I've been to Bretton Woods and been in the room where it was signed, but I wasn't there at the time. And I suspect the US said, we won, so we're going to do it our way. And there was very much national interest behind that, I imagine, and that served its purpose for the late 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, and then of course Nixon kind of got us off of that, and we went into sort of the modern era of fiat currencies and what have you. And I think nations wrestle with the impossible trilemma, right? You have to decide whether you can have two of three possibilities, right? You can allow free capital flow, you can set your interest rates, or you can set your exchange rates. And depending on, you got to pick two of the three, right? And depending on what you're up to, what your challenges are as the governments pick two of the three. They're always looking for new innovative ways to foster their national economic interests. And I think the inevitable consequence, particularly as the U.S. relative power has waned relative to other nations, China and what have you, you're inevitably going to see the rise of alternative currency systems and what have you. My last thought, and I like Steve, I'm not quite an expert in all of this, and I'm going to be all ears when Kathleen explains a lot of this to us, but oil, it seems to me, was kind of the biggie, pricing oil in terms of dollars. And as we transition away from that and what have you, that's another pressure on the dollar and in favor of other currencies, I suppose. So that's kind of a little bit of a rambling answer, but I don't have a really crisp one for you.
Can I ask if Keynes had been successful with the bankor concept, would the world have been completely different today, or do you think it would have still been a different set of problems? Is that a fair question?
I think it would have been a hugely different system. I mean, for a start, just to put in terms of putting in a theoretical framework, the best argument about the nature of money comes from Augusto Graziani, the recent Italian circuit theorist, in my opinion. And he explained that money is a triangular system. You have a buyer, a seller, and a bank that records the transaction. And then when you get to the national level, you have banks that exchange with each other, and they exchange through the central bank. So you've got another set of triangles on top of the fundamental in non-bank triangles for the commerce we all do on a daily basis. Then you get to the global level, and there should be another triangle. There should be the national central banks and a central authority, which also has money, its own form of money that exchanges at that level. And just like, and this is a bit of a benefit of people like George Sell going to be joining us shortly, on the lower level we exchange fiat and credit money. On the medium level, which is where the banks, this banks operate with the central bank, they exchange reserve funds, which are not the same as money. And then at the top level, you'd be exchanging a bankor, which is an artificial created currency with its own rules, which Keynes designed to limit the scale of trade deficits and trade surpluses. So Keynes regarded countries running a trade surplus as basically following a beggar thy neighbour policy. His argument was to try to reduce trade deficits to no more than I think 2% of GDP. And what we've got instead in the American-dominated world, America's running a trade deficit of between 2 and 6% of GDP. Other countries are running trade surpluses like Germany, originally not so much these days, Japan, Korea, China, of up to 10% of GDP, and a massive level of imbalances come out of that. that we wouldn't have had if the bankor had existed. So I think we'd be in a far better world if Harry Dexter White had an unfortunate car accident on the way to Bretton Woods. Unfortunately, he didn't.
Kathleen,
I think running through Keynes's work is the concept of a negative feedback loop or a stabilizing mechanism, like the strategic petroleum reserve. When oil prices are high, you sell oil from the buffer stock into the market, and when they're low, you buy and you fill up the stock. Or the national budget, you deficit spend and whatever in times of recession. And then the bankor was kind of a buffer stock stabilizing mechanism, adding a thermostat, if you will, to the system. And others have tried, like Jim Tobin and his Tobin tax, to get, tap down speculation and currency trading and what have you. But yeah, I think it would have been a different world.
And a better one. But Kathleen is one of the people who had to cope with the actual system that was built.
Well,
and like the plumbing you're speaking about is very important.
I'm not a fan of...
Sorry?
Well, I that explanation was a little bit incomplete, because it's actually commercial banks where most of the money moves, which you'd expect because they're doing business with capital markets and with each other and with businesses. So, for example, on any given night, because it's a batch clearing, Citibank will move 3 to 5 times as much money as Fedwire, the Federal Reserve System, on any given day.
Wow.
So actually, money tends to move more in commercial banks than it does in central banks. Okay. And I know central banks like to think they're the center of the universe. And my first boss, Jerry Corrigan, who's president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, told me that no payment is final until it crosses our books. But that's not actually true, because payments are final when they cross Citibank's own book clearing as well.
Okay.
So, this is why the understanding of the plumbing isn't quite that simple. And a solution that's going to work has to work at commercial bank level.
Kathleen, I saw that you were at the launch of the network state with Balaji Srinivasan, and I wondered if you were a keynote speaker there, and you were talking about some of these issues. What did you take away from the people that are involved at that level and the ideas of the network state? Well, not necessarily the network state, but there are people talking about these issues from a much more decentralized point of view, which goes with what you're talking about. I just wanted your views on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the energy there was amazing. I was the next to last speaker of 40 speakers, and I thought the auditorium would be empty, that they'd all have gone to the cafes by that time. But in fact, it was still standing room only. And the energy was so intense. When I left the stage, I was mobbed like a rock star, which has never happened to me at a banking conference. So that was a great experience. It really was, and very inspirational in some of the. I wouldn't necessarily put money into some of them, but some of them are definitely trying to change the system. And yeah, since that's what I've done throughout my career, obviously, I wish them luck. I think it's an interesting time to be innovating.
And Steve and Mike, I'm presuming, sorry, this is maybe assumed knowledge, but you've followed the network state and Balaji Srinivasan's background, I'm presuming?
No, had my head in computer code for the last 3 weeks.
No, that's fair enough. Yeah, no, it's maybe Kathleen, I think better to get Kathleen to explain if you can. Kathleen, just the event and the sort of the background to the network state.
I'm not sure I can do that. I mean, sure. I know Balaji from Twitter. We've had a few chats, but I'm not deep into his business and background. I mean, I'm amazed. He's got like 1 million followers on X, which is awesome. And certainly, he's a bit of a larger than life character in terms of making things happen. Bringing his vision forward. With him.
I thought because you're a keynote speaker, you might have
with him quite a bit, but it's usually about something particular where it's my expertise that he wants, rather than me getting into his network state stuff.
Yeah, I understand. Very good. Now, unrelated, but I'm I'm just curious. So, is there back when you were at the Federal Bank of New York, the Reserve Bank of New York, was it at the time in the late 80s, early 90s? Was that then the largest gold reserve in the world, or is it, or it had already been surpassed by then?
Do you know what? Nobody knows.
Right. Okay.
First of all, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York has custody of foreign custody gold. So it holds Bank of England gold, and it holds Russian gold, and it holds gold for the IMF. It's the U.S. Treasury gold is held at Fort Knox. So the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is only agent for other people's gold. And the other thing I'd say, cautionary, is that the most secret thing central banks have are their gold swap books. Nobody knows what they've done or how much gold is really there that hasn't been swapped out. This is not, this is just a mystery. We just don't know.
Wow. So do they publish stats, or they don't even publish statistics on it?
No, they don't. It's totally secret. It's done through these very, very secret gray books, and it's unpublished.
Wow.
I mean, I can, and it's not just, the thing, the only time you find out about it is when a bank fails. And I know this because when I was at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Drexel failed. I don't know if you remember Drexel Burnham Lambert, huge investment bank. It was half the junk bond
That was
market.
That was Milken,
right?
It was Milken, wasn't it? Milken's
It was
fund.
Milken.
Yeah. Okay.
It was. So when Drexel failed, I was called to the president's office randomly one day and introduced to a very frightened looking European central banker. Drexel had been huge in gold swaps, massive. In fact, it was the margin calls on the gold swaps book that destabilized Drexel, not the junk bonds.
Mm-hmm.
I was given the job of telling this central bank that they were never going to get their gold back. The only time you see the swaps is, when there's a failure. And let me tell you, that central bank is still lying. They carry that gold on their books as if they'd never swapped it out.
Mm. Kathleen, let's actually get back to your book then, which I think we might have some. We might be able to bring up on screen some info about it, but it would be great to talk about the main themes, which I know you've already hinted at. But I'm just thinking about the big problem as you have seen it. Let's go back and you've got another copy there too. I would hope so. Let's go back and just look at the big problem that you see coming or have seen coming, and what's going to happen next, basically, in the world.
Okay, there's two parts. There's sanctions. I've always hated sanctions. I think unilateral sanctions are almost always a form of self-harm. They always come back and bite you. So that's part of it. The other thing that worried me, and this goes back to 2019, is the destabilization and illiquidity of the US Treasuries market. Because US Treasuries are fundamental to liquidity in the world. They're the collateral behind almost most interbank finance and trade. And from 2019, I really became very concerned that the US Treasury market was growing dysfunctional and illiquid. And I even went to the extreme of going to the Bank of England and warning them about this. And they, of course, said, there's nothing wrong. It's very liquid. We trust the Fed. And the Fed knows, and they're managing this. And then, of course, in September of 2019, overnight repo shot to 10%, which is insane in US Treasuries. Overnight credit at 10%. The market just gridlocked. It turned out later that it was because JP Morgan had refused to transact in the repo market that day. And just them sitting out, the size that they are, meant that the market became dysfunctional. So then I began to really look at what the world could do to defend themselves if treasuries destabilized. And that's when I really became interested in the idea that countries would move I didn't see it happening this fast, but I did become convinced that countries would move to what's now called local currency trade, that they trade either in their own or their partner's currency, at least as far as trade in goods is concerned, so that the mercantile economy, and this is where the mercantilism comes in traded goods, is shifting at speed into local and partner currencies.
So give us an example of what happened beforehand and what happens now when you've got people trading in local currencies or neighbor currencies rather than trading in the American dollar. What's the change in the plumbing?
Well, for example, Russia and China, like everybody else, used to trade in dollars and euros.
Mm-hmm.
Convenient, low cost, reliable, liquid. They now are doing more than 240 billion in bilateral trade with each other. And all of that, or at least 99% of it now, it was 95% 6 months ago, it's 99% now, is in either yuan or ruble. And that it doesn't go through SWIFT. It goes directly between their banks bilaterally.
Okay.
Because that's all directly from the Ukraine war sanctions. It's since that time, right? Almost completely, or not?
Yes.
Yeah, but yes. That's interesting. Well, the whole thing about SWIFT. So pardon me, this is a question for you, Kathleen. SWIFT was actually weaponized as well, wasn't it, at some stage? I've forgotten in which case it was, but I think some country, may have been Iran, was refused access to SWIFT, which is another case of politicization of the monetary channels of our societies.
Yeah, I think non-U.S. nations bristle at SWIFT. Yeah.
Yeah. So what used to happen was that Russia and China would trade with each other through the American dollar, through SWIFT. All the transactions are settled at the New York Federal Reserve, which is where I believe all these transactions are supposed to settle. Now what's happening instead is China. Sorry?
It would settle through commercial banks. Commercial bank money.
Okay. Now it's going through Russian banks to Chinese banks. So Russian companies are buying Chinese goods with rubles. Chinese companies are buying Russian goods with yuan. So that means that those companies are ending up with Chinese companies have got your Russian currency. Russian companies have got Chinese currency. So what they then have to convert that into national exchange markets back into their own currencies. Is that what then happens next?
Well, it depends what the preferences are. If there's a preference to hold balances, then they can hold the balances. But one thing that's notable, and let me just go into plumbing for a second here.
Yeah.
Both China and Russia have been preparing for this for a number of years. They've known what was coming. They've known that the United States is going sanctions mad. And obviously, Russia has been aware that the proxy war in Ukraine was intended from 2014 when the coup occurred. So, they've both been preparing for the long term. Both of their payment systems have been modernized. So the Russian payment system MIRS, this is where the plumbing comes in, is built to exactly the same global open data standard, ISO 20022, that SWIFT uses. So the banks that were using SWIFT could easily move into MIRS. And the Chinese interbank payment system, CIPS, also uses ISO 20022. So the fact that there was this global data standard.
Sorry, can I break in there? I just wanted to ask, there's a great question here from Dregai, one of the chatters, just asking if how does quantitative easing figure into all of this? Is that something that's exacerbated this problem over time?
I'm sorry, I missed that. What was the
we had a question from one of the chatters, and they wanted to ask, how does quantitative easing figure into all of this, if at all?
I think that's actually outside the discussion here, because quantitative easing is mainly that's American, the central bank manipulating. Yeah. Okay. Take it away. Yep.
Quantitative easing frightened the Chinese, and the Chinese started winding down their Treasury portfolio almost from the first year, quantitative easing actions by the Fed. So China was the largest holder of U.S. Treasuries, not the largest. Japan's the largest, but they had a very, very substantial portfolio, over 2.4 trillion in U.S. Treasuries. And then from the issue of quantitative easing, they've been winding that down. And the reduction in their portfolio of treasuries has been accelerating much more rapidly lately, because Trump put sanctions on China in 2018. Biden has doubled down with multiple rounds of economic sanctions on China. So why would China want to hold credit of the United States government? And they're continuing to ramp down their treasury holdings. And it does go back, it dates to quantitative easing, because quantitative easing effectively meant that there were no limits on how much monetary value could be created and globalized.
This sounds a bit like a historical example. It sounds a bit like what happened when Volcker put up the rates so dramatically. That actually caused the third world debt crisis at the time, because quite a few countries had borrowed in American dollars, Argentina being an obvious example. And suddenly they went from rates of 2 and 3% to 17%. And that led to the breakdown of monetary systems outside the United States, all because the United States was trying out Milton Friedman's formula for reducing the rate of inflation. So it made people realize that they, being many other countries, it's a handicap to be caught up in the American financial system, because that also ties you into the American political system. And if you thought the finance was a disaster, wait till we introduce you to the political system in America.
Mike, what are your thoughts on
yes. Actually, I was fascinated with the third world debt crisis when I was young. And I actually went to law school wanting to be an international lawyer, renegotiating third world debt, and then ended up at the Fed issuing bonds for the World Bank. So,
yeah.
Mike, do you think there was ever a solution to this that if things had been different like 20 years ago or anything like that, or from a system point of view, was this always it was always going to end up like this, where sanctions would get referred to just because it's a power struggle, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. I think behind all of the economics is usually political stuff, right? And the policymakers use the tools they have available to them, right? And so I'm not terribly surprised. I'm not terribly surprised at the reaction of the Chinese government to quantitative easing. You act in your own national interest, and how things would have been different is very hard. You'd have to kind of model it to even have a conversation about what might have been, right? Because there's so many feedbacks and interactions.
We're not going to hold you to it. You can have an opinion. Very good.
Kathleen, do you think is your book describing what is coming about, or is it an advocacy for what's coming about?
Well, actually, is the question, if I can be so, because to step in, Steve, there's a question there from Joe that might actually be very similar to that. What would Kathleen suggest the world do to respond to the Putin invasions of 2014 and 2 years ago? Sanctions seem like a sensible approach, perhaps a boycott. What might have been done differently, do you think, Kathleen?
Well, I've never been a fan of unilateral sanctions. The UN Charter discourages them, and I think for good reason. But the amazing weaponization of the dollar and SWIFT and virtually all large global banks against Russia was a huge wake-up call, but not for Russia, because they anticipated it, and they had largely wound down their exposure to the United States by then. They were surprised that Europe went along with it to the extent that Europe did. And this is going to destroy Europe, unfortunately. I feel sorry for them. They got railroaded into following the U.S. line, and countries. There are a lot of countries that will suffer very, very long term. Germany, obviously, deindustrialization. Swiss, loss of global deposits. Everybody much higher energy costs. So that's very unfortunate. But also, it's partly that the narrative control is breaking down. When the Russians started the special military operation in Ukraine, the entire Western media was unprovoked attack. Unprovoked attack. Unprovoked was the big word. And every single narrative outlet, every media outlet used that exact same phrasing, unprovoked attack. Now, the reality is that Kiev had stationed 100,000 troops on the border of Donbas republics ready to invade, and the Donbas republics asked Russia for protection. But that narrative almost never gets told. So this is actually something that we see in real time right now with other conflicts, is that the Western media will try and force a united narrative, its preferred story, and it's increasingly getting challenged. Truth is breaking through, and that really is partly because the rest of the world no longer trusts anything that the West says anymore. They haven't kept their word in any of their treaties. They certainly didn't keep the Minsk Accords about Ukraine. So it's very difficult now to push a single
Minsk
line.
Accords, the ones in which Ukraine promised to give up nuclear weapons in exchange for protection. Just following up and making sure that's what you mean.
A whole lot. I mean, is it
no? The Minsk Accords were negotiated for the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, the Donbas Russian-speaking republics, to basically have a certain amount of autonomy while remaining Ukrainian. And the guarantors of those accords were France and Germany. And both France and Germany premiers have admitted that it was a fraud from the get-go, while they rearmed and trained Ukrainian soldiers to fight Russia. So François Hollande in France and Chancellor Merkel in Germany have both admitted that it was always a big fraud, that they always intended to have a proxy war against Russia.
Yeah. And if you look about the history of the American dealing with Russia during the collapse of the Soviet Union, American economists were largely responsible for pushing Russia for extremely fast transition from socialism to capitalism on completely stupid grounds. One of the people who's responsible for that was actually Jeffrey Sachs. Sachs has now realized how bad that whole idea was. I actually had an interesting Twitter war fight with him, friendly fight, but about 8 years ago, where he said that once he got inside the State Department, he found the State Department was intended using the transition to destroy Russia. Now, the crazy thing is they'd already destroyed the Soviet Union. Wasn't that enough? They should have stopped. But they wanted to wipe it out as a potential rival. And that's a huge part of what's been the background to the Ukraine war as well.
Mike, can I
Yes, that was severe depression. It was 3 times worse than the Great Depression of 1932.
Yeah, huge
So the collapse in the Russian economy was 3 times worse than the Great Depression.
And I have, I was in Russia quite a while ago. Yeah. Just to give you an anecdote, Kathleen, on that front, I was meeting my equivalent at the Russian University of Humanities, which used to be the V.I. Lenin Instruction Center under the Soviets. And just doing as you do as heads of department, you discuss, how many staff have you got, blah, blah, blah. And my Russian colleague said, he gave a number and said, we had more in the past. And I asked what happened to them. He was walking along one of the streets in Moscow in this conversation, and he stopped and gave me a quizzical look and said, they died. I went, what? And he said, well, the transition occurred on New Year's Day, and New Year's Eve is a big celebration in Russia. We all woke up the next day to find prices had increased by a factor of 4. And if you didn't have connections with the countryside, you could no longer afford to buy food, and you starved to death. So he said quite a few of my colleagues died of starvation. And that gives you an idea of just how severe that transition was. And it was mainstream economists who were responsible for the theory behind it, and the State Department for pushing it. And the intention of the State Department was to destroy Russia. And they wonder why Russia is angry.
So I wonder, some people have been
Yes.
asking
So
how
I think the movement now. Sorry.
That's okay, Kathleen. It's the time delay hassle. We don't hear you in time when you start speaking, so you've got the floor.
Yeah,
Talk over
absolutely. You
Mike.
just keep going,
Talk over
Kathleen.
Mike. Yeah.
Well, let's try and be a little bit more optimistic. Now that
Okay.
countries are aware that they have a risk and need to take action to secure themselves, they're doing it, and it's probably going to be absolutely great for about 7 billion people on this planet. In that it will break the stranglehold that U.S. models and U.S. dollar and U.S. government had, which to a great extent impoverished and held back development. I mean, we've talked about Russia, but the policies that made countries insecure also affects South America, Central America, Africa, and of course Asia. And new models are occurring and proving themselves, which can radically improve life and economic stability for most of the world now. Obviously, Singapore, China, South Korea, Vietnam. Vietnam's a huge success story. Are very different political models, but the one thing, Malaysia, and Indonesia, great economies. The one thing they have in common is that they've taken action to protect their internal economies and to engage with the world in a way that limits the scope for destabilization. And those models are now being shared, along with internal, what China calls infrastructure-led development, that you build the hydroelectric dam first before the city, right? And then you industrialize once you have the energy. So China's going into Africa and very aggressively building things like roads, railways, hospitals, universities, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power stations, and is now co-investing in things like mining and, in particular, domestic processing of raw materials. And that completely changes the model for a lot of countries in a very, very good way. So you see that generally in the BRICS Plus cooperation, that everybody says, BRICS Plus doesn't really exist. They hardly have a website. They have no secretariat. They have no offices. They have no officials. They have no rule book. They have no membership criteria. But if you look at the margins of every single BRICS meeting, hundreds of billions of dollars in bilateral development plans are being signed off. So Dubai Ports World will build the first super container port on India's coast. India has all of that huge coastline, 0 super container ports. Dubai Ports World manages super container ports, will build that for them. So that's what BRICS Plus does, is it brings in a new model of cooperation that sidelines the debt-fueled development model of the IMF or the World Bank.
And Kathleen, do you see this as a particularly new part of history? If you go back, where are we like? Because we've always had a dominant currency when you think about it. Before the US dollar, it was sterling. Before that, I think it was you go back after that, before, Portuguese, and I think the Dutch. They all had a dominant currency that was used. Are we in a totally different juncture point that we haven't experienced, or are we just going back to something that we've had a long time ago? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's more like the late 19th century or the interwar period between World War I and World War II, where you had multiple currencies in Europe that were largely pure currencies with imbalances settled in gold. Gold was money back then, and everything else was credit, as J.P. Morgan said. So I think it's more that we're going back to that sort of system. And what's interesting, people say, oh, well, there could be a common BRICS currency. I don't think so. They don't want that, and that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that they will do business in each other's currencies. But in Moscow, there's a gold exchange. In Shanghai, there's a gold exchange. In Dubai, there's a gold exchange. If you want to get out of rubles, if you want to get out of yuan, if you want to get out of UAE dirham, buy gold. You can export the gold. There are no export limits on gold purchased through those exchanges. So we're almost returning to a gold-backed mercantilism, like proved very, very stable from the 1860s to World War I, and then almost got traction. It got screwed up because of reparations between World War I and World War II. And of course, after World War II, the IMF was founded with gold reserves. The World Bank was founded with gold reserves. The BIS was founded with gold reserves. And the US held half the world's gold.
So there's been some chit chat by our viewers about broadly contagnation, like the failure of long-term capital management or the 2008 crisis, or more recently, Silicon Valley Bank and the most recent rounds of stress testing. So folks would like to know how your framework and how you see the international currency system evolving, how that relates to the problem of contagnation.
Going to jump in and just take a quick break. We're going to jump over to have a look at some of the meanest tweets that Steve has been getting over the last few weeks. Now, Steve, I know you're a wilting violet. I'm not sure how this is going to go, to be honest with you, but we're going to try it out. We just found a few tweets that are about Steve, and so let's go. Basically, Steve.
Oh, there's no answering that one. It's dog shit, and there's never been right about anything. Is he Australian? That's a good guess, because I get trashed in Australia for predicting house prices are going to fall, and in fact they rose. What pisses me off about that is the reason they did is because I scared the pants off the government. And 1 week after I was interviewed on the major current affairs program, Kevin Rudd doubled and trebled the amount of money that the Australian government gave to first home buyers, and the Victorian government chucked another 40% on top of that. So a first home buyer in Melbourne could buy a house with zero deposit of their own money, but have $35,000 from the Australian government. And much to my amazement, that caused the house bubble to keep on rising. So, that's why my particular prediction came of the housing was screwed by the government doing what's called MMT, with modern monetary theory being used to maintain a Ponzi scheme, which is the Australian housing bubble. So I'm guessing that's where the dog shit came from. Next one, please. We got another one there or not? I'm just going to look at dog shit all night. Here we go. Same thing. This is what's so ironic, because I made the mistake of falling for a bet with a guy called Rory Robinson. And the way this came about was that I was interviewed on the 7:30 Report, which is the major news program in Australia. With normally there'd be 4 or 5 minute segments. I had 15 minutes to myself with the guy who ran the show, Kerry O'Brien. In that, it was the first time I think I was asked about house prices. So I'd got on the major current affairs program of the country for half the show, and then I'm asked about house prices. When I said, well, I saw Japan's house prices fall by 40% over the 10 to 15 years after their bubble economy burst, and I see no reason why Australia won't have the same fate, that became the only thing I ever said, the fact about house prices. Now, the fact that I predicted a financial crisis, which happened in the rest of the world, and Australia avoided mainly because they restarted the housing bubble in a panic, partly inspired by my news coverage, this is where all this shit comes from. So the dog shit comes out of the fact that governments don't do the right thing with modern monetary theory capabilities, which they have, of course. What they do is the wrong thing. They maintain housing bubbles, and that's what Australia's been caught up in. So, this is one reason I'm very, very loath to take on bets these days. So William Nordhaus's nephew asked me to take a bet about the collapse of of Western civilization courtesy of global warming. I gave him a condition under which I'd take the bet on. He didn't fulfill the conditions. I said, Buggy, I'm not going to take the bet on, because once you take on the bet, people are all about the bet itself. They're not talking about your analysis. So screw that. I don't do bets anymore. The biggest foreign on the planet. Got so addicted to modeling by watching his YouTube video. Lost my wife, my dog, and my home. Fuck you, Steve. I don't know how much pleasure he's getting out of his dog and his wife and his home beforehand. So thank you, Ty. I just saw where that one came from. Very clever. Very clever.
Why do I think that whole segment was just set up so Ty could insult you?
Yeah, I think that was the case. He came to the back.
And every week.
I'll brace. Now that I know that's the subtle trick, I'll brace myself in future.
Yeah. So no predictions, Steve. They're just predictions generally are a problem, aren't they?
Well, I mean, you think that bets are a problem, because if you take a bet, this is like Kathleen's. I'd like to have a good look at your analysis and talk about the way you explain the multi-currency world we're heading into. But if you get up in a bet, like say you bet the American dollar is going to fail in 5 years, then all people will look at is the bet. They won't look at the argument behind it. So my advice to anybody who's caught up in making contrary social judgments and so on, don't take on bets. Bets will lead. The media is trivial enough as it is. As soon as there's a bet on the table, that's all journalists will ask about. They won't ask about the analysis. You'll lose the argument without even getting a chance to engage in it. So avoid bets.
Kathleen, let's pick up where you were, because we're talking about the possible positive outcome of all this. What would be let's say you were deciding what the policies could be, what would be the outcome you think is wisest from here, and why, if that's not too bold a thing to ask?
Well, I think it's dangerous to make predictions, but obviously the cooperation of BRICS, which is now 11 countries, because it expanded with Sudan, Egypt, Iran, and Saudi and UAE, which is very interesting. You know, if you look at it now, BRICS Plus is controlling 40% of the world's oil. That's certainly something to watch, because their cooperation is deepening as they invest in each other. So, Saudi now has petrochemical plants as joint ventures with Chinese companies in China. So Saudi is shipping its oil to its own jointly owned petroleum processing plants, and then benefiting from selling that energy into the Chinese economy. That is a really powerful model. For a long time, China and Ethiopia have cooperated on agriculture, because one of the challenges in Africa is that countries in Africa were discouraged from growing their own food. They're really required to import grain from Iowa farmers and only grow cash crops like cocoa or rubber or coffee that don't feed people. Where China has managed food self-sufficiency, even though it only has 6% of the Earth's arable land, which is an amazing achievement, amazing technology that they've brought into the agricultural sector. And now they're sharing that technology and the methods and teaching Africans how to be self-sufficient in food. That is a real game changer for Africa. So that's quite positive. In terms, there was a mention of bank failures last year. Let me just say that Silicon Valley Bank was an amazing outlier. It didn't look like any other bank, partly because it had such a huge amount of uninsured deposits, because their business model was, if you do your seed round with us, we'll finance a 0-rate loan on your Lamborghini. If you do your Series A with us, we'll finance a 1 or 2% mortgage on that beach house in Malibu you so deserve. And so it had a huge concentration in the tech sector, with huge unsecured deposits. In fact, its biggest creditor, had it failed, was a crypto coin. that was, linked to the dollar, that basically held its dollar deposits in Silicon Valley Bank for over $1 billion. So it was a very special case. And then also they seem to have had a not very good treasurer for risk management who bought the long end of the Treasury curve. So that as Treasury started to devalue with rate hikes, even though most of that portfolio was what was called hold to maturity, which means they don't have to market. As soon as there was insecurity about the bank being viable, which spread like wildfire, it was the first WhatsApp speed bank run. So that 42 billion was called out on the first day of the run, and to get the cash for that those withdrawals, they had to liquidate their hold to maturity book. And unfortunately, as they liquidated it, they of course made the entire Treasury market unstable and illiquid, and that forced then the Fed and Treasury intervention. But really an extraordinary bailout that broke every single rule of central banking back to Badgett.
SVB, but it wasn't bailed out, was it? Or do you mean something else? What am I missing?
Well, they were effectively bailed out because what happened was the FDIC forced a merger into another bank and then took on all of the losses. I think it was like 778 billion in losses onto the FDIC book, financed by the New York Fed.
Yeah, I mean, that was a classic case where putting up the rates, the interest rates, had an impact on the value of the bonds being held by most of the banks. And this was being done by a bunch of economists who just focus upon the interest rate and don't think about the viability of the monetary system. They don't understand double entry bookkeeping. I know this from far too much exposure to the idiots.
Nothing safer than U.S. Treasuries.
Yeah.
Most liquid market in the world.
Yeah, and bang, if you devalue.
Except when it isn't.
Yeah, that's right, because you had like the 30-year bonds, so the longest, I think they're the longest term bonds that the Treasury issues. They're so close to consols, it's ridiculous at 30 years. So if you take the rates from 1% to 5%, which is what the Fed did over that period, you devalue those bonds by about 80%. They go from being worth $1,000 to $200. And of course, if that's a large part of your assets, you're suddenly bankrupt.
Mike, I'm going to bring you in here because I haven't heard from you. I can see you thinking about this.
So yeah, I just wanted, so in light of this conversation and in Kathleen's framework and her observations as to where international currencies are going, what is the does it increase or decrease the likelihood of contagion, international contagion, should there be another long-term capital management or some other financial crisis?
Right. Well, it's very hard to know because there's some new models emerging. So, for example, Argentina had a liquidity crisis and was defaulting on its debt, and in particular had to make a payment to the IMF. Now, Argentina didn't have the dollars; it had run out of its dollar reserves. But what China did was allow Argentina to use its swap line with People's Bank of China to borrow in yuan and repay the IMF in yuan, which because it's one of the basket currencies for the IMF special drawing right, is legally valid. So, and Argentina has now done that 3 times, drawn on the swap line, and instead of paying back dollars, which it borrowed, it's paying back yuan because it can. So that's a stabilizing action, which is really quite, there is a lot of innovation going on and a lot of experimentation, which is towards stability, towards mutual reinforcement and stability.
Because the actual system we have has been made so unstable, both by the fact that it's the American dollar rather than the bankor, and also by America's politicization of all the financial channels. So obviously what people are trying to achieve is a more stable financial system than the Americans have given us.
Yes,
And it's going to
exactly.
naturally move that
I'm
way
very optimistic.
anyway, Kathleen, or has it already done it?
So, Kathleen, we have to get you with a better data
Sorry?
connection next time, because we have to get you with a better data connection next time, because the spontaneity of the conversation is declining by the fact that you have this 5-second delay, which means we ask you a question and then before you've answered it, somebody's talking over the top of you. We're very sorry about
Yeah,
that.
so I'm sounding very rude. I apologize, but yeah, I'm trying to gauge just the 5 seconds and then jump in, but it's not working.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
I've sort of
Unfortunately, I had super fast broadband. All of the United Kingdom had super fast broadband. We were the first country to have it, but unfortunately, it was provided by Huawei, and the United States required United Kingdom to follow its lead and rip Huawei out of our networks, and nothing has worked very well since.
British decision making is the only thing that gives me faith in American decision making.
So, Kathleen, can I jump ahead then? Some of the solutions that you that you've hinted at was that a return to a form of gold standard, I think, or at least some sort of gold reserves and enhanced gold reserves. Is that right? And I was just going to get Steve and Mike's view on that with you, if you don't mind. So maybe just outline your thoughts there. And Mike and Steve, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are.
What I will say is just from a factual basis. Central banks are buying more gold than they've bought since the 1960s. They're back above the gold level purchases in the early 60s before Bretton Woods fell apart. So clearly central banks are making a heavy move into gold. And big gold producers, in particular Russia and China, are increasing their gold reserves at a very steady and large rate. But even countries like Poland, which is a strong US ally, has been buying record amounts of gold. Turkey has been adding consistently to its gold reserves. So they haven't said why. They're not telling us why, what they're planning. But I think it indicates an awareness that gold is necessary as a reserve asset. Because gold is if gold is in self-custody, that's an important point. It has to be assayable. It has to be in self-custody. Then it has no credit risk. And the sanctions have made all countries very aware that if you have any custody at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, at the Bank of England, which stole the Venezuelan gold, expropriated the Venezuelan gold in 2019, then you've got credit risk. So a lot of central banks all over the world are moving to gold in self-custody as a defensive mechanism, restoring. We don't know what role it's going to play in the monetary order, but yes, very likely it has some role.
So what we're seeing is sorry, you go, Mike. Yeah.
Oh, just real quick. Sorry, Steve. Do you think it's a coordinated effort among the central banks or imitation of one another, the buying of gold?
Oh, it's so very hard to know because central banks are secretive animals and often not entirely honest in what they say in public. Obviously, the BRICS Plus are coordinating. There's a finance ministers meeting next week for the BRICS Plus, where the finance ministers and the central banks will be together. And it would be amazing if things like this weren't discussed. But they're not being public about what the plan is. And sometimes they're laying false trails. Like there was a false trail dragged through Twitter a few times about a BRICS currency as a synthetic currency of gold and other commodities. There isn't actually any work being done on that because I've checked. But occasionally you get these false rumors as well. So it's very hard to know exactly what they're coordinating.
And Steve, what would your take be if that ends up being the new normal? I guess where gold reserves as well as currencies laid on top would be the solution in the long run.
Well, this is for international trade, and what you've got. I mean, the idea of gold as money, because money being a commodity, is a fallacy in terms of how money has been created over time. It's come out of credit rather than out of commodities. But the international stuff, we have at most countries we have a functional domestic monetary system. What we've never had is a functional international monetary system. What we've had instead is major powers like the UK when it was it ruled the waves, and now America using its political power to make its currency the form for international exchange, and that has all sorts of perverse effects. One obvious one that we've seen with America is that the American dollar gets overvalued, so American manufacturing loses out. So people ship production offshore, exploiting low wages elsewhere. It's corrupted the whole political system. So, given the fact that we have never had a functional international system, I'm nowhere near as upset as I would be if we had people saying we've got to have a gold-backed domestic currency. Talking about gold being used for international exchange, given the fist that America's made of its own dollars and the fist that the British did beforehand, having something which is neutral in the sense which gold is as a way of balancing international trade imbalances doesn't concern me as much if people are talking about bringing in gold and having a gold-backed American dollar within America.
Do you understand? Kathleen, so what's next with the book? You've just launched it. How's it going, and what's the reception been?
It's been actually pretty good. It now pays both the BT bill and my mobile phone bill, which is exciting. It's selling. It's gaining credibility. I've got my fans, which is lovely. People write to me and tell me, how excited they were to read the book and to see a positive vision for the future. That, it's not all doom and gloom, that the end of American hegemony leads to World War III. Because much of the world is moving peacefully towards unification and mutual security, mutual cooperation on faster and more stable development. So that's all good. I think, yes, we've got the biggest problem is the overhang of 340, is it trillion in debt? Yeah, it must be trillion.
Well, Steve, Mike, what's your thoughts on debt?
And layered on top of that debt is the complexity of derivatives, where we have very little transparency as to how that would net out if there were instability or bank failures. Or even clearinghouses. I've modernized several clearinghouses, including LCH ClearNet. And you hope that you get it right in the design of the clearing mechanisms and the margin mechanisms and the waterfalls. But until something goes wrong, you really don't know. And usually when something goes wrong, everybody panics and the central bank bails everybody out. So it's, we keep building very complex systems and then deciding we don't want to see if they work. So it's very difficult to know how that would resolve in the sense if there were a major systemic crisis.
Yeah,
so one of the. Sorry, Steve. Go ahead.
So we've got a totally stuffed up international currency system at the moment. So something what you're talking about of people bringing in these multi-currency exchanges is really trying to band-aid up a very, very badly designed core system. So there's no wonder that people are trying it, given how bad the foundation system is. But what I'd be curious about is if you can explain.
It could be better. There's something I want to build that would make it a lot safer.
Yeah.
I'm a plumber. That's what I do. I would like to build the bit of plumbing that's missing for the 80 countries, and there are now 80 of them, that have, as a matter of policy, committed to moving to local currency trade. None of those 80 countries has global interbank liquidity. So I would like to build that piece of plumbing. Any venture capitalists out there that want to build the multipolar order, get in touch. But it was difficult. I had dinner with somebody who was an executive at CLS Bank, who That's the foreign exchange clearinghouse that clears an average of $7.5 trillion a day in foreign exchange settlements. I built that. Yay. Anyway.
Was that the one you got an award for?
He was telling me that.
But anyway.
No, that was for the central bank modernization solution, which is now running at 14 central banks. Fully real-time, fully modular, fully cloud native, secure, absolutely central bank in a box. That's what won me the award. But anyway, CLS, they tried to build a netting system for smaller currencies because there's only 18 currencies eligible for the big real-time gross settlement foreign exchange settlement system. And they wanted to build a netting system for the less liquid currencies. The regulators killed it. The regulators didn't want smaller currencies to be more liquid, to be safer in foreign exchange.
So I think one issue here that Kathleen alluded to was bailouts. And I'm not suggesting that bailouts are a bad thing in the sense that, hey, just let the contagion go on and let's let the system collapse. But I do think there's a lot of moral hazard in that people in the financial system and the banks don't have to be held accountable when they screw up. And then the bailouts have to occur and everybody just moves on rather than, now I'm not sure we have to jail them, but I don't know that they should be running anything anymore after they screw up. So do you think that a more diversified international currency system might damp down some of that, Kathleen?
It's hard to know because corruption and fraud go with banking wherever it happens. We tend to think of corrupt banks being Nigerian banks, right? No, but there's a lot of corruption, a lot of bad bookkeeping anywhere in banking, including G7 countries. When I was at the Fed, I was brought in. I was actually flown down to Atlanta to hear the confessions of the staff of the Banco Nacional de Lavoro branch in Atlanta that had written over $2 billion in loans to Iraq to Saddam Hussein using fraudulent grey books. That it was a huge fraud that they wrote in special books that were never shown to the auditors.
Oh, God.
And then, of course, once this became a scandal, because it turned out that a lot of it was connected to intelligence agencies, all of the books were seized and buried. End of scandal. So, in any banking system, it's only as good as the checks and the balances. Auditing bank examiners are not a complete defense. The Basel Accords gave large banks huge discretion over what's called internal modeling, right? Where they get to mark their own book to market with their own models. And the examiners aren't really in a position to challenge a Goldman Sachs or a Morgan on whether those models are valid. And nobody really knows except, under stress conditions, because they all use the same methods of, value at risk accounting, which is an historical model that looks at, sort of the average volatility or the average liquidity, or, which is not really suitable to panicked markets that go completely illiquid, like happened in March 2020, when you couldn't even get a bid on US Treasuries. So, any banking system has fragility, has vulnerability. That's why they're regulated.
I'm going to jump in.
And many countries actually
Kathleen.
have state-owned banks precisely because of that.
Apologies for jumping in. I just want to give a quick shout out to one of our sponsors, Kathleen, if that's all right. It's for Planksip, which is a philosophy and culture media outlet. Planksip helps emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. So if you're a thought leader and you're looking for more reach, you should check them out. Go to planksip.org. And while I'm here, actually, I'll just mention Steve's work. If you want to deep dive on more of what Steve's doing, get a critical look at economics from a professor of economics, then join his Patreon page, patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen, where most of his posts are free and there's no paywall. So but let's get back to it. Mike, sorry, I'm going to jump in and get Mike's opinion there. I can see you thinking about what Kathleen's talking about too, Mike. Can I get you to just give us your thoughts on some of the things there that Kathleen's talking about?
Well, I really am interested in the notion of stress testing banks and how to do that properly. Because it seems to me when we do our dynamic modeling, we're not just looking for system redesigns that make the system behave better. And you got to define what better means. But we also want, in addition to better, robust and resilient systems, so that as the airplane's flying along, the banking airplane, as it's getting buffeted by wind and rain and so forth, it's not doing this or doing this. It's fairly smoothly flying along because it's well designed. It's a robust system. So if there's some incompetence or malfeasance of some people in the banking system, the whole system doesn't collapse, right? The airplane doesn't crash. So how do you do that? What kind of modeling needs to be done? Who needs to be doing the modeling? What information do they need to accomplish this modeling? I'm assuming it would be, the bank regulators, the central bank, or what have you, that would be in charge of it, maybe even at the state level in the US. But I do think that kind of thing is important, but I have no idea how to make it happen.
Can I ask a question here, Kathleen? I'd like you to describe some of the plumbing you've done. You mentioned the one you got the award for. Can you give us the details on that? Now, I'm actually curious about things like whether you're writing, I don't imagine you're writing software, but are you putting down specifications of software? Are you putting databases in place that enable transitions to occur? All that sort of stuff. Because that's the sort of, I'm into plumbing, putting it that way. So I'm a plumber fan, so I'd like to hear what you actually do when you do the plumbing.
Okay. I'm more big vision, knowing how central banks work, what central banks do, knowing what clearinghouses do, knowing how commercial banks operate for themselves and for their financial institutions' clients, their nostros, their vostros, and looking at how to make that plumbing more liquid, more stable, less risky. So, that's basically my last 30 years. The quantum central bank solution I worked on because I thought it was one of the biggest miracles in IT I've ever seen. This company called Intellect modernized the Reserve Bank of India from basically a state where everything was done on paper and required at least 2 signatures to a fully digital, fully modern central bank in less than 2 years. And it was because of that modernization that they were able to withdraw large denomination notes from commerce and roll out mobile payments and basically an incredible what's called unified payments interface, UPI. And it's UPI that's enabling India to globalize the rupee. Because since they rolled out UPI, and this is only like 7 years ago, they've now entered into Vostro arrangements in rupee for more than 35 central banks and much more than that in terms of commercial banks globally. So it makes it very, very fast, convenient, easy to do business in rupee. Bank of England has a Vostro account at Reserve Bank of India. So that's that kind of innovation I thought was an absolute miracle when I heard about it. And I went to them and I said, let's take what you've done for Reserve Bank of India, which is a very specific case, and see if we can replicate that and globalize it to other central banks. So that's what my work was because the Reserve Bank of India system uses a denomination of lakhs. I don't know if you've heard of lakhs. It's like 100,000 or something. Anyway, the system was written in lakhs.
Yeah, it's a measure, the Indian measure of numbers. Yeah.
It is. And so, for example, I shifted them from that to millions, because millions everybody can do as a global standard. One funny thing, the entire system that they had built, which was, as I say, biggest miracle I've ever seen, was all in black on white, black text, white screen. And I did point out that other color pixels didn't cost any more. So, I got them to do debits in red and credits in blue. The first time we showed that to a central bank, they literally gasped. They were like, oh. And then I got them to
My
put in some
eyes, they
data
hurt.
visualizations, like your portfolio visualized, so that you could just take a look at the screen, see that everything's okay. They've done some amazing work in terms of setting up alerts, so you get a real-time alert if there's anything wrong anywhere, with a deep drill down capability, so that you can go into the system and find exactly where the problem is, how big it is, and what you can do about it. I mean, this
Kathleen,
is actually
can
true.
I
My
go-
first boss at the Federal
Oh, sorry,
Bank of
you
New York,
got-
when Drexel failed, he
Sorry for the
came
delay
up
there.
in front
It's
of
hard
me.
to
There were all
see.
35 lawyers were gathered.
I've got something that I wanted
And,
to ask Kathleen. It was about your. I'm sorry to jump in. It's hard to know with the delay. Sorry if you'd finished not. But there's a great way you had of illustrating the scale that you're talking about when it comes to multicurrency mercantilism. It's kind of like you were talking about the scale of transactions really in the world, and I guess you got that from the BIS. I'm not sure, but it was the idea of the actual transactions and the ones that are going on in global trade, and there was a big number difference between them. It was from a talk that you did, but it was. Am I helping jog your memory at all or not? I'm not sure, but it was really illustrative of
You
kind of like
are.
you know what I mean, though. It was just really interesting
Let
that
me just see if I
the
can
bit of the
find
global
that
trade that we think is
paragraph.
huge is not that big.
No,
And it kind of put
all
everything in
global
perspective.
trade in goods. This is not digital trade. This is not finance. Trade in goods globally is only about 45 trillion. So when you think that, tri-party repo is 18 trillion a day, that's 3 days of repo, right? All global trade annually is 45 trillion. It's a very modest amount. Crude oil is about 4 trillion. Processed energy, petroleum, diesel is about 9 trillion. These are relatively small
is huge.
numbers.
So yeah, where is all the trade going? What are the other numbers?
Right. The other numbers are the financialized part of the economy. So there's now 340 trillion in bonds. The interbank finance, as I said, is 18 trillion a day. And the average trade size is 44 billion. Think about that. I had no idea what I was doing.
The average size of a
equities,
trade, the average size, $44 billion.
The average size of a single average trade in the interbank repo markets is 44 billion. Yes, I did that. Equities, about 108 trillion annually in market capitalization, with average market turnover about 40 trillion. TG. Derivatives. Now here we get to big numbers. Derivatives are about 635 trillion in notional values. And then the margin flows on that 635 trillion are going to be, we don't know exactly because it's not well reported. It's very difficult to aggregate the data, but probably somewhere between 5 and 10% of that. So say between 30 and 60 trillion in margin movements. And then foreign exchange settlements. Now we get to the biggest number. Foreign exchange flows, 1,400 trillion annually. We don't know why. Why are they doing that? What are these foreign exchange trades for? We don't know, but it's really, really, really big numbers. So yeah, if we just move
sloshing
the
around,
48 trillion in trade
what are
into
your?
local currency.
Does that surprise you at all? Those numbers? Sorry, Kathleen. I'm just going to ask Steve and Mike for their view on that.
Well, that's just the sheer scale of financial speculation, and this is what we've really had as right from the start of Bretton Woods enabling the American dollar to be the system for international exchange. We had currency trading coming out of that. We had forex markets developing. We've had the growth in the financial sector. If you look at the post-World War II level of finance, the total level of private debt in America was about 50% of GDP. Now it's about 170%. And going back to my father's days as a banker, Dad used to joke that when he was almost became a executive in the Reserve Bank of Australia. He's given the choice, and he stuck with the Commonwealth Bank and the retail world because he liked working with people, strangely enough. A bit hard to put my father in that category, but that's the truth. Anyway, so he said at the time in the 1940s and 50s that the central bank governor told the governors of the private banks to jump out the window. They'd asked which floor. He then said 10 years later, when the governors of the private banks are telling the central bank governor which floor to jump out of. And the more debt you have, the more power the financial sector has. And we've gone from, we've trebled the level of debt we got to after the Second World War. That's what we should have stayed at, about that level of private debt. And instead, by increasing the gearing of the financial sector, we have a financialized global economy where far more paper changes hands, figuratively speaking, than physical goods do. And it overwhelms the physical side of the economy that mainstream economists almost naively think is the actual basis of international exchange. It's all about gambling in the financial casino, unfortunately.
Yeah, if you were to remove
this is why I can be an optimist.
Yeah, sorry, Kathleen. Yeah, you.
I was going to say this is why I can be an optimist, because if all of these countries move, let's say, right now at this moment, only half that 48 trillion in trade and goods is in US dollar. So it's 24 trillion. If they manage, these 80 countries, to move half of that into local currency trade, that's still only 12 trillion. We're not even going to feel it. We probably won't notice because it's so amazingly tiny compared to the financial flows. And the dollar will still dominate financial flows. The US Treasury will still dominate as collateral, as a high quality liquid asset for clearinghouse margin, for bilateral derivatives margin, and for collateralizing tri-party repos. So the US Treasury will still be able to issue treasuries, and most of the world will still use them for those financialized functions, even as they move real world goods trade into much more stable, much safer local currency trade.
It begs the question why they ever thought that sanctions would be a powerful tool. If do you know what I mean? And does that not strike you as because it's so small, sanctions could never really be a thing? But I guess the idea was they're targeted, not that they've ever worked. I don't know a scenario where sanctions have worked that we could point to, but yeah, it just seems that the scale of what they could target was small. Is that clear thinking? Do you think, Steve or Mike? Is that, or is that not the right way to think of it?
I've had a few spats with people who are from the U.S. Treasury or ex-Treasury about this, because they really have a blind spot. The groupthink inside, particularly the sanctions unit, is they do not allow challenge. They do not allow anyone to question whether what they're doing is A, legal, B, sensible, or C, realistic, because sanctions themselves have become such a huge growth industry. There's all kinds of software out there that's only about sanctions, about implementing FATCA, filtering for everything. And if you don't get it right, you get $1 billion fine. So the sanctions industry and groupthink means that they don't actually look at whether this is good policy anymore. I'm a huge fan of someone named Norman Angell. And Sir Norman Angell won the 1932 Nobel Peace Prize for his insight that when two interdependent economies, modern economies, go to war, they both lose, because the harm to commercial expectations, to credit markets, to trade, to commerce in a sanctioning state will be almost as great as the harm of the loser of the war. And that's what we're seeing, that the G7 has sanctioned itself into irrelevance, so that you now have a recession in Europe, a recession in Japan, a recession in South Korea. You've only got the US growing at a very modest 1.6% because Janet Yellen is printing, $100 billion in new debt every 10 weeks. No, 14 weeks, every 14 weeks. Still pretty good. It's the G7 has sanctioned itself into irrelevance, unfortunately, and it's going to be very hard to restore global trust and global trade, and that's largely because of sanctions.
Yeah.
And Mike, can I ask you, or Steve, but Mike, I was just picking up on that idea that sanctions, have they ever worked? Is there ever a reason to have used them? I don't even know if there's a historical example of going, yeah, they work. We should keep doing it.
Yeah, I think the main advantage of sanctions is you're not putting boots on the ground or sending drones over or something a country. You're punishing them financially.
Yeah, but does it work? Is what I mean. Does it actually punish anyone? Because I think that's what Kathleen's saying. They didn't in the case of China and Russia.
Well, it obviously, it devastated, for example, the Cuban economy. It devastated the Venezuelan economy. It did cause poverty, starvation when the sanctions were first implemented.
Right. So, but
now Cuba has lots of
policy of them, though, did it?
Iran. When the Shah was in power, fewer than 10% of Iranian school children had any education. Now they have 99% literacy. They have the highest proportion of STEM, science, technology, and engineering graduates of any nation on earth. And 60% of those STEM graduates are women. And that's Iran. And that's why Iran's technology is all native now. And they have no exposure to Western technology. They don't need it. They've built their own. So, yes, sanctions can work in the short term to devastate an economy. But increasingly, the economies that are devastated are learning from each other and how to work around.
I think the one time, it was actually mentioned by Joe Polito here, the one time sanctions have potentially worked is with apartheid. Could that put pressure on South Africa to reconcile, you get rid of the apartheid period? But that, in a sense, even though there's all sorts of negative consequences since the collapse of apartheid in terms of economic performance and corruption of the ANC and so on, that was successful use of sanctions done, if you look at the rest of the world's point of view, from a general humanist point of view. But America's used the sanctions to try to attack Iran, to attack its enemies, to penalize anybody who doesn't go along with their military incursions. And I think that's been incredibly destructive, as you're saying. And I hadn't even thought about it, but there's actually a sanctions unit inside the American government to decide who to impose sanctions on?
It's in the U.S. Treasury.
Oh, God almighty.
And it's huge. It's huge.
What sort of people staff it? Are we talking ex-capis from the Cato Institute? What sort of people end up there and end up running that unit?
I don't know. I haven't lived in the United States for 35 years. I sort of obviously follow them the way I follow any large country. But most of that sanctions unit, OFAC and all of that, fatca, has grown up since I've been living here in Britain. And, obviously Britain is the lapdog of war. We will go along with anything the United States tells us to do. So we always go along with their sanctions, but I'm not part of that policy, partly because I despise it so thoroughly.
I'm going to do a bit of searching and see if I can find any details on it, because, the whole idea that there's a unit for sanctions, it's, like there's a unit for arms deals and et cetera, et cetera. The corruption of the political system we've got out of America is just appalling. And a large part of what you're talking about is countries trying to get away from the politicization of economic exchange.
So, well, I mean, for example, actually, you're going to need to look a little bit more broadly, because within Treasury, for financial sanctions, it's the Office of Foreign Assets Control. But the economic sanctions, like the ones that were issued on Huawei for technology, banning chip sales, I think those are run out of the Commerce Department.
But as you say, some of the impact of those those sanctions is encouraging people to produce their own domestic capabilities, and that's been quite obvious. Iran has done dramatically well there, and China, and China is now doing the same on producing its own chip foundries.
Exactly. Huawei now uses domestic chips in all of its new phones, and its new phone, the P60, which is also a satellite phone, so that if you lose signal, you still have satellite, is outselling Apple, and it only launched last year.
Wow.
So, China is very, very heavily motivated to remove all risk from its supply chains because of U.S. sanctions.
Yeah. And this is a way in which the weapon has actually shot the person, and the weapon has shot the wielder of the weapon in the face, because the whole idea of sanction was to weaken and bend people to America's will. And what you're seeing instead is people are saying, we don't want to be subject to America anymore. We're going to produce our own. And it's actually weakened America.
That's right. Kathleen, Taiwan's TSMC sales are way down, which is part of the reason why Taiwan is in recession. And Japan's chip sales are way down, and so are South Korea's, because people don't want, when you think the Chinese economy is 1.4 billion people, so that's 1 out of 6 people on Earth, and they own literally millions and millions of companies that manufacture things using chips, but they are all trying to de-risk. That's millions of actors acting independently, but collectively recognizing that they're at risk of U.S. sanctions.
And on the reverse side of things, Kathleen, was I right in thinking that your view on the nearshoring of trade, at least in Europe, maybe Britain, is that didn't sound like something that was genuinely happening? Was that the right reading of what you're saying? Whereas over in places that want to move away from the states of being sanctioned, it's a fraud. So I was going to get you to unpack that.
I think it's a massive looting of the Treasury. I mean, we see it here in the UK, where the UK government has subsidized the building of a number of huge plants to domesticate production of chips was one of them. Electric vehicle batteries was another. And these huge billion-pound subsidies are going to these companies that build the shell of a plant that they then abandon, and nothing is ever produced.
Right. Okay.
But by then the subsidy was banked. And you were seeing that with the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act subsidies in the United States. I don't believe that TSMC plant in Arizona will ever produce a single chip. And even if it did,
they seem serious about it.
Yeah, because the cost of that chip relative to a chip from Taiwan is going to be 10 times more. Who's going to buy it?
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, no one until China invades Taiwan, I guess. But it depends on I think
won't have to invade Taiwan.
Thing. Well, I hope not. I mean, call it, of course, but yeah. I think, is it not a hedging, that nearshoring? It's like a strategic sort of, or do you think it's maybe just symbolism or just flat out fraud?
You know what? It's getting really hard to tell the difference these days. I mean, Rishi Sunak just gave his father-in-law a 1.4 billion subsidy for a new plant here in UK. Go figure.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the great dilemmas we have right now, that we tend to treat our political leaders as if they are politicians who wish to lead, but they're often grifters who want to enjoy the largesse of being at the top of a political system. The farce of Trump in America and Boris Johnson in the UK, and it hasn't gotten any worse with Rishi Sunak, as you say. So they've got their hands on the levers of the state, and they're using it to direct money into the pockets of their friends. It's ludicrous levels of corruption.
Absolutely.
Well,
Great little
and
anecdote.
Mrs. Sunak,
Just this week,
Mrs. Sunak,
was
who's a big shareholder in Infosys, is already planning for the Sunak family to move back to California if Rishi loses the general election.
Oh boy.
It's not like they even have a long-term interest in Britain.
well, what do you get a boy
He
who's got
happens to
everything?
be
You
our
get him a
unelected
prime
prime
ministership,
minister.
I guess. No, he's got that. Go home or go somewhere else. I'm gonna. I think
Yeah, well,
we're gonna get you to read our top chatters at some point here, Kathleen, which is a bit of a tradition here. You might have seen this before on the show if you've watched any other shows, but you can do it as fast or slow as you like, and you can go from left to right or down the rows. But these are people that tune in regularly. They're big supporters, and so go ahead and read them out. And of course, you have to get them perfect. No one's ever failed getting them completely perfect, so there's no pressure. When you're ready.
okay, I'm not sure what I'm doing, but
You're reading out from she
I
watches.
can't see the chat, actually.
No, just the what's on screen right now.
I can't see the
She
chat.
watches. No, you can't. You don't have to see the chat, Kathleen. Just she watches. Start from there. Can you see that under Steve Keen and Friends?
No, I'm not seeing anything.
Oh dear, this is your data connection again.
Or maybe this is okay. Do I have to take one for the team here, guys?
You do, Dave. It's up to you. Yeah, it's yours.
Okay. All right. She watches Web Freaks, Danger Zone, Economics in One Lesson, Josh Buckham, Tony Wilson, Douglas Jr., JD, JVNR,
this is great.
Tom Roberts, Political Economy 101, Understanding MT, Thomas Darlington, Mike Ristar, not sure about that one, Blue Bay, Steve Frith. Now you've got me, DGR Geek. I'm going to make this on a bigger screen, and you know what I mean? Even with glasses, this is a problem. Breaching 565, Downtown X Mastery, Michael D'Souza Cruz, What a Gushu, Blah Blah Large, Jesus, obviously. Hey, Jesus got some great words on taxation. Rick O'Brien, Skylar Jones, Dregai, Connor Howell, Dean Walsh, John Watson, Bob Law, Shane Coughlin, Michael Newman, Ghost in the Half Shell, Larry Summers, David Collins, DJ, Matthew, Alan Plant, Mungai Mugo, G-Bay 088, Danny, Ken Crawford, D. Smith, Jim Roberts, Colonial Antibody, and Bill Goggin. There, I took one for the team for you, Kathleen. So you're welcome. You missed that.
Well, I saw you had a lot of game people in your chat and fans. I will say that what I'm working on for launch in third quarter is a game that will teach gold-backed mercantilism, because we haven't played that game for 100 years. So I do have a game in development that will show you how you can create an economy that's based on gold reserves, that monetizes that as banknotes, and then uses the banknotes to build the economy through investment and trade.
Maybe you can run that through Minsky, Steve.
Yeah, I think it's got a different foundation, I think. But how are you developing the game, Kathleen? What are you've got a game developer working with you, or are you coding it yourself, or what's happening there?
I'm writing it right now, and I'm about halfway through. It's based on a game that was played very, very popular in the interwar period, and it was played quite widely on both sides of the Atlantic. And then, unfortunately, as soon as Bretton Woods issued, monopoly took over, quite literally.
Yeah. Okay. So based on monopoly. Is it a board game or
it's more resurrecting? It's played with game pieces, so it is a tabletop game.
Okay.
We are getting close to the top of the hour, and I just want to say, Kathleen, thank you so much for kind of worrying me and then putting my mind at ease, kind of all in the same place. It's a really interesting point of view you've got, and a really amazing bit of experience where you are with hands on so many levers in the global economy. So it's pretty amazing. I think, just so you know, everyone, next week we'll be talking to Denise Hearn, co-author of The Myth of Capitalism. We'll be talking to her about the issue of monopoly inequality and whether competition can solve inflation, among other things. So make sure you hit that notification bell so you don't miss that. Steve, Mike, any last thoughts for Kathleen, or observations or quick questions that you had for her?
I just appreciate getting somebody who actually knows the plumbing of the financial system in here, and we'll have to have you back again with a better data connection with me with a better headphone.
Very good. Till next time, stay safe. Don't drink while operating heavy machinery, and be nice to someone randomly. Take care, and bye-bye.